This story contains disturbing and heartbreaking content. Please proceed with care. I think he fell off the couch, she said. But nothing about the infant's injuries matched that story. The bruises, the skull fractures, the internal bleeding, it all told a different truth. A darker one. On the surface, it was a story of hope. A woman who couldn't have children finally got to adopt. A baby given a second chance at life. A family finally complete. But behind the closed doors of a home in Barrow-in-Furness, England, what unfolded was a nightmare no one could have predicted, or maybe one the system should have. The woman who had fought so hard to adopt a baby ended up being the one who took his life. A baby named Leiland James Corkill, just 13 months old, whose cries for help were silenced forever on January 6, 2021. Today, I'll tell you a story that shattered a community, exposed a system's failures, and left a mother mourning the child she never got to raise. A story that began with hope and ended in horror. Let's start with the little boy whose name deserves to be remembered. Leiland James Corkill was born on December 21, 2019 in Cumbria, England. A winter baby, arriving just days before Christmas. From the very beginning, those who met him spoke of his light, his gentle presence, and his infectious smile. His eyes were wide and bright, full of curiosity and warmth. He was the kind of baby who made you pause, who drew you in with the soft weight of his gaze and the innocent energy that filled every room he entered. He didn't have long on this earth, only a year and a few precious days. But in that short time, Leiland touched more lives than most do in a lifetime. He was a joyful child, quick to laugh and eager to be held. Charlotte Day, the first woman who cared for him during his infancy, recalled how cheerful and responsive he was. Even after undergoing surgery for a digestive condition, he recovered swiftly, gaining weight, learning to sit up and meeting his milestones with the quiet determination that made everyone around him proud. There are pictures, dozens of them, captured during supervised visits with his biological mother, Laura Corkill. In these photos, Leiland smiles as he's cradled in her arms. His hands reach for her face and she beams back at him, lost in the soft joy of holding her son. 4 times a week, for an hour and a half each visit, Laura cherished every second. One photo in particular stands out. Leiland in a baby blue onesie, his cheeks flushed, resting peacefully against his mother's shoulder. It would be the last photo ever taken of them together. Leiland never learned to walk. He never learned to say mama. But he lived. He smiled. He was loved. And he deserved so much more. To understand how Leiland James Corkill ended up in the Castle household, we need to rewind to 2 very different women, both named Laura. The first was Laura Corkill, Leiland's biological mother. Her life had been scarred by violence and hardship. Years before Leiland's birth, she endured a toxic, abusive relationship. When she finally gathered the courage to ask social services for help, to remove her violent partner from the home, they responded not by protecting her, but by taking her children away. That decision broke her. Her world unraveled. But when she learned she was pregnant with Leiland, Laura saw a chance at redemption. A chance to be the mother she hadn't been allowed to be before. She decorated the nursery herself, picked out the name long before his birth, and connected with support groups for women who had suffered domestic violence. At 22 weeks pregnant, she met her first social worker, who reassured her that there was no reason she wouldn't be allowed to keep her child. But that hope was short-lived. Just 48 hours after Leiland's birth, a social worker stood by his crib and took him away. The second woman was Laura Castle, who lived in Barrow-in-Furness with her husband Scott. She couldn't have children. The pain of infertility weighed heavily on her, and adoption became their only path to building a family. They passed every requirement: interviews, home inspections, psychological assessments. On paper, they were ideal candidates. In August 2020, Leiland was placed with them for adoption. Social services maintained temporary oversight, reserving final approval for permanent custody. It was supposed to be a trial period, but even during those early months, something was wrong. Laura Castle admitted, sometimes in private messages, sometimes to social workers, that she didn't feel a bond with the baby. His constant crying irritated her. She called him names: fat, lazy, devil spawn. She screamed at him, shook him, and tried to discipline him the only way she knew, through violence. Yet despite red flags, the system continued forward. The Castles were allowed to keep Leiland, while the woman who had given birth to him, who held him in supervised sessions and loved him fiercely, was told to move on. By Christmas 2020, the Castles were still struggling, but no one intervened, and on January 6, 2021, the child they were meant to protect would take his final breath. It was just after 6 a.m. on January 6, 2021. Scott Castle had returned home from a night shift and went straight to bed. 2 hours later, he was jolted awake by his wife, Laura, standing in the doorway with panic in her voice. The baby fell from the couch. Downstairs, 13-month-old Leiland lay unconscious. His breathing was shallow, his body limp. There was no sign of movement, no sign of life. Laura's first instinct wasn't to call an ambulance. She attempted first aid, then waited. At 8:30 a.m., over 2 hours later, she finally dialed 999 and reported a child in critical condition. Leiland was rushed to Alderhay Children's Hospital in Liverpool, where doctors found extensive and devastating injuries. There was swelling and hemorrhaging in the brain, spinal trauma, and bruising across his body. The medical team did everything they could, but by the next day, Leiland was gone, just a few weeks after celebrating his first birthday. Laura Castle's initial explanation, that Leiland had fallen from the couch, quickly unraveled. The injuries were far too severe. Doctors compared the force required to what one would expect from a high-speed car crash or violent shaking against a hard surface. There were signs of repeated abuse: bruises on the face and ears, damage around the mouth from forceful bottle feeding, and internal trauma that could not have been caused by a simple fall. Under questioning, Laura confessed. She had shaken Leiland violently to stop his crying. His head hit the armrest of the couch, accidentally, she claimed. She said she lost control, that she was tired, overwhelmed, that she didn't mean to hurt him. But the evidence told a different story. Messages recovered from her phone showed a pattern. She had complained bitterly about Leiland for months. She described him as unbearable, unlovable. She admitted to smacking him, to pulling him roughly, to wishing he would just be quiet. Scott Castle, though not directly involved in the final act, was complicit in silence. He had read those messages, had responded to her complaints with dark jokes, once even texting, "Give him a good hard slap," followed by a laughing emoji. But he never acted, never intervened, and when it mattered most, he wasn't there. By the time the truth came out, it was too late. From the moment paramedics arrived, suspicions surrounded Laura Castle's version of events. The injuries simply didn't add up. A fall from the couch couldn't explain the level of trauma. Trauma that specialists later testified was more consistent with what they'd expect in victims of shaken baby syndrome or blunt force impact. An autopsy confirmed what doctors already feared. Leiland James had suffered severe brain swelling, hemorrhaging, spinal damage, and internal injuries. There were multiple bruises, some fresh, others older, evidence of repeated harm. Detectives soon uncovered the couple's digital footprint. Text messages between Laura and Scott painted a chilling picture. Laura had described the baby using words no child should ever hear. She admitted to smacking and shaking him and spoke openly about her frustration with his crying. Though Scott wasn't physically present during the final incident, he had known about her outbursts. In response, he offered empty comfort and at times dangerous encouragement. The abuse was no secret between them. During formal questioning, Laura Castle initially clung to her story, that Leiland had simply fallen. But under mounting pressure, she changed her account, now admitting she had shaken him, that his head hit the couch and that she panicked. She insisted she never intended to kill him. She was charged with manslaughter and child cruelty. Scott Castle, though not charged, was investigated for his role in enabling the abuse. His failure to act became a subject of public outrage. The trial began in 2022. Forensic experts detailed the force required to inflict such injuries. One testified that the trauma could only have occurred with both violent shaking and impact against a hard surface. The injuries could not have been accidental. Leiland's biological mother, Laura Corkill, testified in tears. She spoke of her son's smile, of their precious supervised visits, and of how she was told he would be safe. She called his killer a monster and condemned the social services system that had promised protection only to place her baby in harm's way. On May 25, 2022, Laura Castle was found guilty of manslaughter and child abuse. The judge sentenced her to life imprisonment with the possibility of parole after 18 years. Scott Castle was not charged but left the courtroom disgraced. He had watched the warning signs unfold and chose to do nothing. The public reaction to Leiland James Corkill's death was immediate, widespread, and filled with heartbreak and fury. Across the United Kingdom, parents, social workers, and child advocates expressed horror at the details revealed in court. That a baby could be placed into a home where emotional detachment, physical abuse, and signs of danger had already been documented raised a single, unshakable question. How could this have happened? Social services were thrust into the spotlight. The Cumbria County Council, responsible for overseeing Leiland's placement, came under intense scrutiny. Internal investigations revealed that Laura Castle had previously admitted to struggling with bonding. Concerns had been raised by social workers. There were red flags, clear ones. But the adoption process continued. No one had acted fast enough. No one had pulled him out. Martin Birch, Director of Children and Families at Cumberland Council, later acknowledged publicly, "Mistakes were made. Lessons have been learned." But for many, that statement came far too late. One life had already been lost. Laura Corkill, Leiland's biological mother, spoke out in interviews and in court, demanding accountability. She had been told repeatedly that her baby would be safe, that adoption was in his best interest. She now lived with the cruel irony that she, once deemed unfit, might have been his only true protector. "If he had been allowed to come home to me," she said, "he would still be alive." The outpouring of grief extended to those who had once cared for Leiland. Charlotte Day, the foster mother who had nurtured him in his earliest months, described her devastation. She admitted that this tragedy had shaken her faith in the very system she had trusted. "He was a good baby," she said, fighting back tears. "All he needed was to be loved." Activists and charities rallied around the case, calling for reforms in how adoption assessments are conducted. The case became a symbol, not only of individual cruelty, but of systemic failure. And so, while Leiland's tiny coffin was lowered into the ground, near the headstone etched with the words "Gone but never forgotten," a movement stirred, one fueled by outrage, sorrow, and the desperate hope that no other child would ever suffer the same fate. What would you do if you saw the signs, but no one else seemed to act? What would you say if the system told you to trust, but your instinct said otherwise? Leiland James Corkill was just over a year old. He never learned to talk, never got to run or laugh with friends at school. He didn't get a second birthday. He didn't get a chance to grow. What he got instead was a home that failed him, a system that ignored him, and a final morning that should never have happened. His death is not just a tragedy, it is a warning. We must listen to the warning signs. We must demand more from the systems that claim to protect. And we must remember that love, real love, is not just something you say. It's something you prove every day in action. To the foster carers who nurtured him, to the mother who never stopped hoping for his return, and to every child still in the shadows of broken systems. This story is for them. Leiland's name is now etched into a headstone that reads, "Gone but never forgotten." Let's make sure that's true. Let's say his name. Let's share his story. Let's fight for the children who can't yet speak for themselves, because the only thing worse than a child dying is no one learning from it. Thank you for listening. If this story moved you, please share it. Let the world remember Leiland James Corkill, not for how he died, but for how deeply he mattered.